Hildegard couldn't express her visual in the vernacular. Does this tell us anything about German theologians? And then there is a smaller question about one of the pictures. The nun adoring Mary and her baby is the scroll which was at the side above the nun. Was it an inscription or a series of pictures? So if you do the first one.
Okay. Okay, the nun adoring her baby. This is a page in a psalter, in other words, in a collection of psalms. So it's an illustration in a psalter, and it is one of 4 illustrations which occupy a whole page like that. And then throughout the psalter, there are lots of smaller illustrations. I'm not quite sure if the question about the scroll is actually a question about the little scroll within the picture. Was whoever asked that question? Can they clarify what they're asking?
Is that do you remember in the picture?
Yes, because within the picture you get a little scroll, and this is just the standard medieval way of showing when someone is saying something, and it's the nun who's actually saying Ave Maria. So that's as simple as that. So that's the one about picture. Now, German theologians, I think we associate modern German theologians with systematic theology. And the thing about systematic theology is that you get an insight about God, and then you feel you have to work out a complete system of how that insight affects the entire theology of just about everything you want to say about God and his relationship to man. So it could be that the Germans are particularly good at systematic theology because they have a sort of systematic way of thinking. I don't think there's a problem with the German language. I mean, Eckhart, for example, one of the great medieval mystics, he wrote in Latin, but he wrote just as much in German. And we have plenty of German writings from the period. So I think what Hildegard is talking about is just the difficulty of expressing in words the content of her visions. She actually finds it a bit easier in Latin because she is actually trained to read and write in Latin. We don't know whether she could actually read and write German, so that's probably why she's got a bit of a problem with expressing herself in German.
Thank you. I think I won't pass that on because it's more to do with Hildegard, unless you want to. You're all right. Stephen, could I have the question, please? Thank you. Would the panel agree that we are, as a society, moving from a verbal to a visual culture? For example, TV. If you'd like to do it first.
Right, well, yes, I would agree to that. And I think it's a sad thing that we're moving that way, because society would seem to be encouraged to think less and to just be entertained more. That is regrettable. I'm just going to leave it at that. It is sad that we see great works of literature reduced to sort of transient, usually violent images on screen. Things like Lord of the Rings, and where there's great allegorical points being made, and it's just reduced to violent war scenes and gothic bloodletting. And the underlying messages of these great writers is passed by society, and I do regret that. I'd much rather a few words thought about a great amount of time than masses of pictures just absorbed in a few nanoseconds and then passed on to the next violent action. So yes, I think society is, to quote this question, moving from a verbal to a visual culture. And it does remind me of the famous quote when I think it's probably Gandhi, when he was asked what did he think of Western civilization, he responded by saying, I think it's a good idea.
Well, I think one of the reasons why we're moving to a more visual culture is to do with the fact that we live in a very international sort of culture. So it's becoming increasingly important that instructions and guidance of all sorts is given visually, because not everybody will have a mastery of the particular language that they need at that particular moment. So I think, for example, on the internet, the fact that there are masses of sort of how-to videos about just about everything, for how to change a light bulb or whatever, I think this is actually extremely helpful, with lots of pictures and videos. So there's an enormously useful side to the visual. I do, at the current time, I agree about the short attention span problem, that we tend to look at pictures, as I say, just for information. And therefore, the briefer the picture is, or the video is, or whatever, the more helpful. You really just don't want to go on and on watching this forever. But a visual culture in itself demands the same kind of attention and reflection that a verbal culture does. I mean, what I was saying, for example, yesterday about Julian working out a theological problem visually, I was saying that in a way she's being asked to read her visions in the same way that we read a text. So I think people from genuinely visual cultures, so people from, say, Far Eastern cultures where you have temples with lots of statues and paintings and things going on, they know how to read, as it were, those statues and those pictures, and they know, and that's as demanding of their attention and a long attention span as reading a text is. I think in our modern culture, which is very fast, the fact that we want everyone, we feel we can't command anyone's attention for more than 5 minutes max. I think that's to do with our modern Western advanced culture at this particular moment. And I think it's probably gone as far as it possibly can. I think we're going to start having a bit of a backlash where people would actually like longer articles and papers and, and more subtle films. I mean, certainly I agree with you about Lord of the Rings, and people complain about the Harry Potter films, that there's an enormous amount of subtle psychology to do with growing through your teenage years, which really just doesn't get into the films. So I think possibly we're going to start seeing a backlash with people wanting a bit more nuance and things, a little bit more complexity in things. I mean, certainly in our public life, we've got into this very polarized kind of interchange with each other, where any issue is a question of the two extremes yelling their heads off and no one actually having a discussion of any sort about the issues involved. So I think that's just a manifestation of our particular very advanced Western culture, possibly at its worst at the moment in Britain. I think I'm not sure that the rest of Europe and even North America are quite at the pitch that we are at in terms of how we conduct ourselves.
Thank you, Santha.
Could I offer two reflections from an ecclesiological viewpoint, as it were? First of all, that the move from the focus on verbal worship to a more emotionally charged worship. In the 1960s, when the liturgical movement was at its height and Vatican II happened in the Roman Catholic Church, the focus of those meetings to do with worship were very much about getting the language right, about moving services from Latin into the vernacular for whichever country the services were happening in. And we followed somewhat later in the Church of England with the introduction of the ASB. And then now 20 years from there, when Common Worship came out, it's very much less about words and more symbolism is coming back into the Church of England services. Common Worship, for instance, is far more Catholic in feel and in instructions and in rubrics than whatever the alternate service book was in the 1980s. Now there are instructions, for instance, on where to put incense grains on a Paschal candle and stuff like that, which wasn't thought of with the ASB. In the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s, in order to get the verbiage right in the service books, a lot of the superstitious, for want of a better words, aspects of worship were thrown out of churches. Churches that were before covered in statues and paintings had those all stripped out and whitewashed. And again, at the turn of the millennium, there's a huge movement now to get those things back in to Roman Catholic and to Anglo-Catholic churches to make them feel more like churches. I think as a worshipping community, whatever our denominational might be, there's a shift towards being okay or more okay with emotion in worship. And I think that's expressed with how churches are being built now and with how furnishings are being put back into churches or put into churches when they're built. Men, it's okay to cry.
Now, this question's rather long, so I may not have all of it. A question for Andrew. How early in Western Christianity were the principles of stability and permanence, and especially verticality, established? I ask this because I have no knowledge of the shape and nature of places of Christian worship in late Roman and post-Roman Britain. How early did the symbol of the development of height, representing aspiration towards God? In the small, mostly narrow Anglo-Saxon churches, Jarrow, for example, is it possible that narrowness encouraged focus of prayer and was a precursor of the symbolism of height and verticality? I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you. Very detailed question. Thank you for that. The development of church architecture in Western Christendom, it kind of happened as and when the early Christian church could get away with it. As soon as the persecutions stopped, before that time, Christian communities met in houses, and after the persecution stopped, some of those houses were started to be built into churches and adapted for use as set-apart church buildings. The one that I'm trying to think of that was excavated back in the 60s, somebody might be able to remember the name of it. Europa, thank you, Keith, yeah. That was a house that was very quickly converted into a specific church building, even though on the outside it still looked very much like a house, but it had a separate room for the celebration of Holy Communion, it had a separate room for baptism to happen. As the Roman Empire calmed down in its attitude towards Christians, Christians began to use the Roman basilicas as their churches, or develop their style of architecture from the basilicas, because the basilicas were the most important building in those towns. Over here in England, Anglo-Saxon architecture, I think, needs a lot more study than what it's had up to now. Anglo-Saxon churches, they are very narrow, but in proportion to their size, they're also very high, very vertical buildings. So I think very early in the worshipping communities over here in Britain, that aspiration of the idea of reaching for the heavens, of transcendence, was there from the beginning in definite church architecture. They're also very sophisticated, although they may not look at Anglo-Saxon church buildings, as well as having the height. We're often told in the architectural books that the windows were narrow because they didn't know how to span wider gaps with the technology of the time. But they were narrow for a reason. They were always narrow on the outside, but the windows had a wide splay on the inside to cast the light in. And often the windows are angled to point at specific liturgical objects within the church. So you can often tell where an altar would have been in an Anglo-Saxon church because the window points the light in that direction. So they must have been quite numinous buildings, as primitive as we might think that they were, because you know that the high points of the architecture, of the furnishing and fittings, and of the liturgy were highlighted by the use of light and of height inside the buildings.
Do any of you want to comment on that, or you? Yeah.
I might just say a bit about the Anglo-Saxon churches. At the risk of lowering the tone a bit, the thing is, just as Christians took over basilicas, and basilicas were basically town halls, as it were, it's where the administration and the law courts of a town went on. And as Andrew just said, a basilica was probably the largest building in a town. So obviously you've got that sense that you need something large and spacious. However, one could also look at that more prosaically and just say that a basilica was where the Christian community gathered, so it needed to be quite a large space. It's also, when we read accounts from the early church, where the bishop basically conducted his court. Part of the Christian gathering was a lot of people taking disputes and issues of conduct and so on to the bishop for his adjudication. So there was a kind of law court dimension. Now, coming on to the Anglo-Saxon model, you've got a similar, possibly prosaic interpretation of things, which is that Saxon architecture, compared to the later Norman architecture, is narrow and tall, and that applies to royal halls, to lords' halls, as it were, as well as to churches, that the dimensions are a bit narrower than we would expect, and surprisingly high. And there were practical reasons for that. You have a fire pit down the centre of the hall. You need plenty of space above you for the smoke to rise, and also for the noise of all the human beings in the hall to rise, so that when you're roistering and dining and what have you, you can actually hear each other because everything is rising. So that would be a very prosaic interpretation, and that churches, therefore, initially are simply built on the model of a lord's hall. That's the prosaic interpretation, but I think that it is very striking that almost the minute you can stop having churches in houses secretly, you go for big buildings, I think, not simply to make, and tall buildings, not simply to make a statement and because it's practical, because you want to gather a lot of people. I think that from very early on, people felt they needed to make space for the angels. When you've got this very strong idea that a worshipping community attracts, like a beacon, as it were, any passing angels, and they come and come and join in. Oh, yeah, So you need space for them, and of course, part of the sort of explanations for how churches are decorated is that up to human head height, you usually don't have pictures, you have kind of geometrical patterns. And then above that, you've got the saints depicted. And then above them, you've got angels, sometimes wooden angels carved in the roof beams and so on, because people had a strong sense that, the human the congregation currently living on earth was there. The great cloud of witnesses on the other side of the veil are just above us, and then the more space you have for the angels, the better, So I think that's part of the theory.
A friend of mine, his wife used to groan every time an advert for Mars bars or something like that came on the television, because working in the newsagents or a sweet shop, she knew that the next day everyone would be coming in asking for Mars bars. And yet none of those customers would have liked to have thought that they could be influenced into parting with their money just through a transient advert on the television. But that's the nature of humanity. We are not perfect. We are not as stalwart and strong-minded as we like to think we are. And perhaps that's why we have steeple houses. Well, as a Quaker, I would use that expression of referring to churches as steeple houses, because the whole purpose of a steeple house or a church, a cathedral, what have you, is to enable your communion with the Holy Spirit, with God. So why do you need all this fancy architecture? Why does a bishop need a palace to live in? And it's because we are flawed human beings, and we have egos, and we have certain aspects of our personality that like to be stroked by aggrandizement. We need to be encouraged to get into communion with the Spirit. If we think about it, we say, no, I don't. I can just take myself aside and sit in a nice, quiet, peaceful place in my garden on a hillside overlooking a wonderful headland and be at peace with God. Well, yes, we can. We can do that. But at other times, on a regular basis, for example, on a Sunday morning, we need somewhere to go to commune with the Spirit. It's a shame that we need that, but we do. We're not as perfect as we want to be. We are flawed, and that's why we have two entities, which is humanity and the divine. So the churches have their part to play, but they're not essential from a purist point of view, but from a pragmatic point of view, they are very necessary.
Sorry, friends, just to build on what Stephen said there, just two quick stories, both surrounding the Church of Sancta Sophia in what's now Istanbul. When this great church was completed, and it was one of the great first cathedrals, I think it was Justinian, the Roman emperor, who walked into it and said, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," which smacks somewhat of egotism and human hubris there. But also when the Russian Empire were thinking what state religion can they adopt for there, they sent two ambassadors to sample the worship at Santa Sophia, and the ambassadors reported back to the Russian authorities and said, "We could not tell, worshipping with those people, whether we were on earth or in heaven."
Why did Jesus teach principally in parable images, the language of experience? If images can be the language of the soul, how are we to find the meaning that might nourish our lives? Perhaps dreams are a model, if some hosting the meaning that we need to grasp.
Okay, well, I think it's interesting that the question puts these three things together, the parables and images and dreams, because they do indeed all share this problem that they can reverberate within us very deeply, and yet we're not quite sure what they mean, and different people get different meanings out of them. We've got a bit in Job where it says that God talks to us in dreams and the visions of the night, but we don't necessarily understand what those are about. So I think there is a problem here that with our normal human thinking, it's very difficult for us to grasp truly spiritual insights, knowledge of the soul. And therefore, one could say that perhaps God needs to bypass the very rational, verbal level of the mind in order to try to get something into us that nourishes our soul or our spirit. And I think, therefore, that there's absolutely nothing to be done about the fact that we don't always understand the image or the dream or the parable. I certainly think that one of the more recent theological efforts was based on a line of thought which said each parable has just one meaning, and you've got to try to work out what it is. I'm sure that's is completely pointless. If you teach in parables, it's because there are different things in that parable which will disclose themselves to you at different stages or different points. So I think the question is right to group all these three things together. And I think there is not actually any simple way of guaranteeing that you understand the meaning. I think in a way we're meant to revisit these things again and again, and different little bits of meaning will disclose themselves to you at different times.
Yeah, just a quickie. I think I said when I was talking about Imaginism that it's a view which I would certainly support, that spiritual insight, as Santha just mentioned, spiritual insights can really only, a strong claim, be conveyed by allegory, myth, parable, rather than by literal description. And that's a very, very important point, I think, especially if you if you include this word myth. Now, myth has a bad press. It's a bit like imagination, it's just a myth, meaning it's nonsense, not worth thinking about. Myth, of course, and there's been a huge library written about myth. Myth is hugely significant, and doesn't just mean fairy stories. It means, I suppose, really a medium through which these deepest truths and insights can be conveyed. And there's a little aphorism that I like about this. I forget it, must get it right. One of the great students of myth said, "Myth is about what always is, but never was."
Yeah, parables and dreams. Why use parables? Why not just come out and say it? And dreams. I think I've never really thought much about dreams, but I'd just like to say that perhaps they're the body's way of rereading earlier messages. There's another thought that dreams are a communication from outside of the body, but and there could be a case for saying that. But for myself, dreams are ways of reinterpreting what's already happened in your life. As far as parables are concerned, why not say it straight? Well, we are flawed, and sometimes we need a story to help get a message over. And why is it that, I was talking to someone earlier, that aromatherapy and smells can speak to our condition? Why is it that when we're feeling very stressed and anxious, and that a soothing massage, a lovely aroma, can remove those stresses? It's all a form of communication. So parables are just a way, with a variety of words, of getting a message over. And I think communication is really what we're talking about, rather than just words.
Thank you. Science imagines that and imagines this in exclamation marks, that all things originate in the material, and what we call spiritual is at best a peripheral effect. What does the panel think of the opposite assertion, that the spiritual is the realm of causes and the material realm effects from that cause? Roger.
Yes, well, that opposite assertion, as the question puts it, that opposite assertion is very much what Imaginism is claiming, isn't it? That the original situation, the initial situation, as it was labelled, was basically derived from the spiritual, from God's imagining, which was a spiritual activity. And from that spiritual origin, everything else flows. So this is very much in line, I think, with the picture that Imaginism is painting. I think the interesting question, sort of going on from this, is, well, in that case, why do we need the physical at all? If the spiritual is fundamental and it starts everything off, why do we get bogged down in the physical? Why did God get bogged down in the physical, if you want to put it in those terms? And that's an interesting question, I think. And I wouldn't dream to give an answer, but I would just suggest that perhaps the spiritual dimension can only be developed, or is best developed, through immersion in some sense in the physical. If you just stay at the spiritual level, you're not going to fully develop. And, I like to think that's perhaps why we're here, in this messy physical world. what's the point of it all? Well, perhaps this is the way, the best way, possibly the only way for that development towards a more spiritual level, the only way that progression can perhaps take place.
The author of the last question will like the answer to this question, because I want to tell you a story. When I ministered in Coventry Diocese, Coventry Cathedral was obviously the mother church for us. And Coventry Cathedral is very much a Marmite building. You either love it or you hate it. But it is an example, a concrete example of the spiritual affecting the physical. When the competition brief was given out and architects the world over were given the chance to respond and design a building, Basil Spence, who won the competition in the end, as many of you will know, was in Scotland, his home place, having a wisdom tooth out. And he was pondering how he might put pen to paper and design this cathedral for Coventry. He was in the dentist's chair, ready to have one of his wisdom teeth taken out. And he was thinking and thinking and thinking and praying and praying and praying how God might like him to have this cathedral to look. And he had a vision of walking down the centre of this cathedral bathed in light, but he couldn't see where the light was coming from. And the altar was indistinct because, in his words, he couldn't see the altar because of the bodies of the saints. And it was only when he got to the altar and turned around that he saw the light flooding in from windows that he couldn't see when he was walking down towards the altar. Now, he came out of this vision and saw the dentist there with the mask ready to go over his mouth. And Spence thought that actually the operation had been done and that he dreamed this vision. And he said to the dentist, "Oh, you won't believe this vision I've just had. You know, it must be down to the gas and air, thank you." And the dentist said, "Actually, I've not put the mask on yet." And of course, Spencer's vision, which wasn't induced by the gas and air, but was a vision, is exactly how the cathedral came to be built. As you walk down towards the altar, there's that wonderful west window where there's the bodies of the saints and angels engraved onto the glass so that you can't see clearly. And of course, the windows are all arranged in a sawtooth fashion that shine light onto the altar, and you can only see the windows themselves when you turn round at the altar end, and they're all fake.
Many of the things said by our speakers remind me of, now I hope I get this right, Josephine Pelande. All right, so it's said, art is that part of religion that mediates between the physical and the metaphysical. He taught that art was capable of manifesting the ideal and therefore of bringing us into contact with it. Obviously not a very Puritan idea, but would the panel like to offer an opinion? Stephen, I'll start with you.
Yeah, art is a great medium for communication, but I'd just like to say it's the message one should be looking for, and not the picture or the artistic artifact itself. One is at great risk of worshipping a great work of art and overlooking the message that it brings.
Yes, I think there is this connecting role, as it were. Very interestingly, in the 1580s, the great explosion of Elizabethan literature is kicked off by Philip Sidney in his work, The Defence of Poesy. And in that Defence of Poesy, what he's really making a claim for is for the capacity of the human mind to imagine things beyond the physical things that they see, and indeed to imagine ideals which are not physically manifest. And I think he gives the classic example of justice. We're all born with a very strong sense of what's fair and what's not fair, and yet perfect justice is never, ever embodied on this earth. So how is it that we actually have this idea in our heads? And when Philip Sidney was talking about poesy, what he actually means is not poetry as such, but the whole capacity of the human mind to imagine things other than what is physically in front of us. In other words, to actually access things like the metaphysical realities and represent them. So I think art does indeed have that kind of role.
I think I'll make a comment here. I don't want to make too many comments, but since I've retired from being a reader, I've had the opportunity of doing more art, or trying to take up art again. And one of the things I'm fascinated by is how can you represent the magnitude and awesomeness of God. I have a favourite artist whose name is Alan Bennett, not the poet. If you want to look him up, you'll see he does trees and things like that. He used to be at Reading University, and he used to come to a place called Nature and Art in Gloucester, where I used to go and have a coffee and things like that. And whenever he was around, because I have some of his paintings, I'd dash over. And we didn't have much time. So our conversation was, well, how do you think you can represent God? How do you think we can convey this? And it was so difficult to actually capture in art, especially a more modern art style, not where you weren't using images of God or a figurehead of God the Father on a throne or something like that. Just actually to present the transcendence. It was fascinating having these conversations. Neither of us really got very far, but it was still really good to have the conversation anyway. So I don't know how you answered that.
I forgot who said it, but there is a quote of somebody saying art is the handmaid of religion.
That's a good one.
I'm reminded of an architect and church designer and furnisher called Ninian Comper. Some of you may know of Comper's work. He died in the 1960s. And this idea of being a mediator between the physical and the metaphysical, Comper kind of brought in artistic and architectural terms this to its conclusion. When he started designing church buildings, he worked through a principle that he called unity by exclusion. And Comper thought that church architecture in Edwardian ages should take off where Gothic architecture ended in previously. And so all his buildings were designed in a very strict perpendicular Gothic style. Those of you who know St. Cyprian's in Clarence Gate in London, that's a prime example of Ninian Comper's unity by exclusion principle. And then he went and did some travelling abroad, and he looked at the ruins in Greece and in Rome. And in measuring the buildings and the sculptures there, took very careful measured drawings of the folds of linen on some of the statues. And then he went around the great cathedrals, the great Gothic cathedrals in France, and when he was doing the measurings of the sculptures and arches, etc. there, he found out that the measurements of the figures, albeit them hundreds and thousands of years apart and in completely different styles, one ancient classicism, the other Gothic, actually the figures were coming out to be exactly the same. The folds of the linen were even identical. So two cultures worshipping different gods, centuries apart. Comper, in his own mind, proposed that actually there is a driving principle, a divine principle in all of us that comes out no matter how outwardly we portray that particular faith or religion. He switched from his principle of unity by exclusion to unity by inclusion. And all of his churches from Edwardian times into the 1960s incorporate a whole mixture of styles, representing that actually all architecture is trying to express the inexpressible, is trying to express the divine. And if you go to his biggest and best and one of his last churches at Wellingborough in Northamptonshire, it's right behind the railway station, From the outside, it looks like one of the great Nene Valley churches. But when you go inside, the Gothic arches are held up by classical columns. And there's a classical screen painted in medieval Gothic stenciling. And yet it all works. And it's a completely devotional building, even though the styles are a complete mixture of different faiths and religions on the inside.
Despite some very favourable publicity, there is still a very prevalent attitude of shock horror by many clergy and church members at the mention of an organisation such as the CFPSS. So what to do?
Well, yes. The question rightly says there is still a very prevalent attitude, and that's quite right, of course. And perhaps one has to look back at a bit to see where this came from, how it grew. And of course you can go back a very long way, but you only have to go back 100 years to see one of the points where the conflict began during and after the First World War, when the Church became very alarmed at the growth of interest publicly in psychical matters, and because of the great loss of life during that war. One of the reasons that I've had great admiration for one of my heroes, Arthur Conan Doyle, was that he threw himself into that controversy at that time. It was very much on the side of the people, if you like, and against the rather set attitudes and doctrines of the Church. I think the shock horror, I can't really comment much on it today, but I think the shock horror probably always stems roughly from the same source, and that's a sort of defensiveness, fear of one's territory being invaded. The Orthodox Church has always been afraid of losing its grip, if you want to put it that way, of having its territory invaded and taken over, or at least infiltrated into from another direction. And of course that word psychical is a red rag to a bull in this respect, because it does suggest that there is an alternative way of finding out about some of those big questions, and not simply by relying on orthodox doctrine. What to do about it? Well, I suppose the fellowship's been trying to do that for 60 years or more. I don't know how far we've got, but I think I'll ask other people to comment.
Yeah. I'll give it to Santha first.
Well, I wish I knew what to do. I think the problem is when you're up against that kind of shock horror mentality, you're actually not going to get through to it in any way, as it were. There are some arguments that if you engage in them, you just increase the general confusion and darkness. You don't actually manage anything constructive. So I think in a way we've followed the path that doesn't seem perhaps to bear massive visible fruit, but is actually, at the end of the day, probably the only effective one, which is actually simply to be here and to continue with our activities without being deflected by the fact there are many people around us who think we are of the devil and so on. But to what extent you can actually persuade people who are going to have a shock horror reaction not to have one? I think we're up against, I think Roger's quite right to put his finger on fear. We're up against a very fear-based mentality that there's no engaging with, in my view.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Really going back to how can we cure the world's ills here? And I like the reference to the First World War. 4 years ago, we were looking at the commemoration, the memory of the start of the First World War, and now we're looking at coming up in the next couple of months, the end of it. And of course we have, and I put in parenthesis, society wringing its hands and saying, oh, what can we do about this? And there'll be great schemes. But what can one do? What can the individual do? My formula is really quite simple. It hasn't been supported by my own Quaker meeting, unfortunately. But my solution is a touch more humility. Humility, and I don't mean that you are a heap type of humility. I just mean putting other people first, being prepared to hear what they have to say, and giving them the dignity and respect that they deserve for their point of view, however much you may disagree. What I do see is a lot of campaigning, a lot of arguments by people who have adopted a partisan position. And in defending their position over whatever the issue is, there's a tendency to become very aggressive, to use violent language, and in no way are you going to bring other people over to your point of view. There's plenty of space on the planet for all sorts of views, and CFPSS has a particular path to tread, and others might not be comfortable with it. Well, that's fine. That's fine. I've said many times that we all find our own way to heaven, and this is yours, and there are others very similar, and there are some people who would even disagree with the fact that there's a path to heaven anyway. I'm quite happy for them to have their point of view, as long as they don't become too aggressive in challenging mine. But if they do, I'll let them get on with it, because it's not going to hurt me very much.
Thank you.
I think Christianity already has a solution to this problem. We've done it many times before. As the church with a big C, we of course create a new denomination and build our own church buildings. Of course, that's a very flippant answer, for which I apologise. I think, as ever with misunderstandings, issues that surround strong opinions and fear, dialogue is always an answer. Dialogue, publicising ourselves in a sensitive but strategic way with individuals and with dioceses and with denominations, and just keeping the conversation going and remaining as a resource for those who are troubled by psychical and spiritual experiences.
Thank you very much. The last question, well, I usually like to look at these. I usually choose a light-hearted to begin and a fairly light-hearted to end. But I've actually spoken to the person who wrote this, and without giving her name away, I will read it to you. I visited a local charismatic church for the first time. The vicar, a very intense man, went around the congregation with a microphone. I couldn't hear what he was asking people. Then, to my horror, he asked me, "What has Jesus done for you today?" Now, I'm going to have a bit of a gap here. She very wisely, after getting over the shock, turned the question back on him, and he wasn't able to answer it straight off. He wasn't expecting that answer. She goes on, "Panel members, what answer would you have given, sir? What has Jesus done for you today?" Oh no, Roger.
Well, I'll just say, because I'm going to get off very quickly, my day so far has been so horrific that I wouldn't want to blame anybody for it.
Davina, what has Jesus done for you today?
Thank you, Santha. Clever.
I'm alive, I exist, and so does the universe.
Well, this is a very profound and incisive question, and in the context of our gathering here today, we should be very grateful to this person for setting us on the path to enlightenment. I'm just grateful to have a sense of humour.
Oh, thank you. So that brings us to an end.